Medieval music encompasses the sacred and secular music of Western Europe during the Middle Ages, from approximately the 6th to 15th centuries. It is the first and longest major era of Western classical music, followed by Renaissance music. The two eras comprise what musicologists generally term as early music, preceding the Common Practice period. Following the traditional division of the Middle Ages, medieval music can be divided into early 500s ages, high 1000s ages, and late 1300 ages medieval music. Medieval music includes liturgical music used for the church, other sacred music, and secular or non-religious music. Much medieval music is purely vocal music, such as Gregorian chant. Other music used only instruments or both voices and instruments, typically with the instruments accompanying the voices. The medieval period saw the creation and adaptation of systems of music notation which enabled creators to document and transmit musical ideas more easily, although notation coexisted with and complemented oral tradition. Many instruments used to perform medieval music still exist in the 21st century, but in different and typically more technologically developed forms. The flute was made of wood in the medieval era rather than silver or other metal, and could be made as a side-blown or end-blown instrument. While modern orchestral flutes are usually made of metal and have complex key mechanisms and airtight pads, medieval flutes had holes that the performer had to cover with the fingers. The recorder was made of wood during the medieval era, and even though in the 21st century it may be made of synthetic materials such as plastic, it has more or less retained its past form. The gem's horn is similar to the recorder as it has finger holes on its front, though it is a member of the ocarina family. One of the flute's predecessors, the pan flute, was popular in medieval times and is possibly of Hellenic origin. This instrument's pipes were made of wood and were graduated in length to produce different pitches. Medieval music used many plucked string instruments like the lute, a fretted instrument with a pear-shaped hollow body which is the predecessor to the modern guitar. Other plucked stringed instruments included the mandore, gittern, citole, and psaltery. The dulcimers, similar in structure to the psaltery and zither, were originally plucked, but musicians began to strike the dulcimer with hammers in the 14th century after the arrival of new metal technology that made metal strings possible. The bowed lyra of the Byzantine Empire was the first recorded European bowed string instrument. Like the modern violin, a performer produces sound by moving a bow with tensioned hair over tensioned strings. The Persian geographer Ibn Khurradadbi of the 9th century cited the Byzantine lyra in his lexicographical discussion of instruments as a bowed instrument equivalent to the Arab rabab and typical instrument of the Byzantines, along with the urgan, shilyani, and the salad. The hurdy-gurdy was a mechanical violin using a rosined wooden wheel attached to a crank to bow its strings. Instruments without sound boxes like the Jew's harp were also popular. Early versions of the pipe organ, fiddle, and a precursor to the modern trombone were used. The tradition of sung prayers and psalms extends into the shadows of early civilization. Such sacred singing was often accompanied by instruments, and its rhythmic character was marked. In the synagogue, however, the sung prayers were often unaccompanied. Ritual dance was excluded from the synagogue as the rhythmic character of sacred music surrendered its more sensual aspects. Even in the prayers themselves, rhythmic verse gave way to prose. The exclusion of women, the elevation of unison singing, and the exclusion of instruments served to establish a clear differentiation between musical performance in the synagogue and that of the street. The musical performance tradition of the Christian Church grew out of the liturgical tradition of Judaism. The melodic formulas for the singing of psalms and the sung recitation of other scriptural passages are based on Hebraic models. Music in the Roman Catholic liturgy was performed mainly for the masses. Originally, the music was performed by the priest and the congregation, until, in time, there emerged from the congregation a special group of singers, called the choir, who assumed the musical role of answering and contrasting the solo singing of the priest. Women participated actively in musical performances in the ancient Christian church until 578, when older Hebraic practices excluding them were restored. From that time until the 20th century, Roman Catholic church choirs were composed solely of men and boys. The first codification of early church music was reputedly made by Pope Gregory I during his reign 590–604. Gregory's collection was selected from chants already in use. His codification assigned these chants to particular services in the liturgical calendar. In general, it reinforced the simple, spiritual, aesthetic quality of liturgical music. The music in this collection serves as a model of melodic design even in the 21st century and is regarded as one of the monuments of Western musical literature. This school of unison liturgical singing is called plain chant, plain song, or Gregorian chant. Specific details concerning how the chant was performed have been lost. There are speculations that the quality of sound the singers employed was somewhat thinner and more nasal than that used by contemporary singers. The authentic rhythmic style of chant cannot be ascertained. There is a theory, however, that the basic rhythmic units had the same durational value and were grouped in irregularly alternating groups of 2s and 3s. Pitch levels and tempos varied somewhat according to the occasion. There are preserved manuscript notations reminding singers to be careful and modest in their work, indicating that temptations of inattention and excessive vocal display existed for even the earliest liturgical musicians. While modern musical traditions in the West are based to a large extent on the principles of antiquity preserved in the notated music of the early church, a secular musical practice did exist. But because of the pervasive influence of the church, the dividing line between sacred and secular aspects was thin throughout a good part of the medieval period. Several types of later secular songs have survived. The musical notations are for the most part inadequate to give an accurate impression of the music, but it is known that it retained the essential monophonic character of liturgical music. One curious type of secular song, conductus, originated in the church itself. This song did not use traditional liturgical melodies or texts but was composed to be sung in liturgical dramas or for processions. For this reason, it dealt occasionally with subjects not religious in character. The Goliard songs dating from the 11th century are among the oldest examples of secular music. They were the often bawdy Latin songs of itinerant theological students who roamed rather disreputably from school to school in the period preceding the founding of the great university centers in the 13th century. Several other groups of medieval performers developed literary and musical genres based on vernacular texts. The jongleur, a group of traveling entertainers in Western Europe who sang, did tricks, and danced to earn their living. The troubadours in the south of France and the trouvères in the north, and the minzingers, a class of artist knights who wrote and sang love songs tinged with religious fervor. Instruments, such as the viol, harp, psaltery, flute, shawm, bagpipe, and drums were all used during the Middle Ages to accompany dances and singing. Trumpets and horns were used by nobility, and organs, both portative and positive, appeared in the larger churches. In general, little is known of secular instrumental music before the 13th century. It is doubtful that it had a role of any importance apart from accompaniment. Yet the possibility of accompanied liturgical music has not been eliminated by modern scholars. The medieval musical development with the furthest reaching consequences for musical performance was that of polyphony, a development directly related, as indicated above, to the experience of performing liturgical chant. For performers and performance, perhaps the most important developments in the wake of polyphony were refinements of rhythmic notation necessary to keep independent melodic lines synchronous. At first, the obvious visual method of vertical alignment was used. Later, as upper voices became more elaborate in comparison with the lower ones, and writing in score thus wasted space, more symbolic methods of notating rhythm developed, most importantly in and around the new Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. In the 14th century, partly because of the declining political strength of the Church, the setting for new developments in music shifted from the sacred field to the secular, from the church to the court. This shift led in turn to a new emphasis on instrumental music and performance. Already the lower voices began to be performed on instruments, both because their long notes made them difficult to sing and because their texts became senseless outside their original liturgical positions. Now, as secular princes became increasingly important patrons of composers and performers, a situation that would continue well into the 18th century, secular and instrumental music flourished. The polyphonic music of the church merged with the poetic art of the troubadours, and the two most important composers of the age were the blind Florentine organist Francesco Landini and the French poet Guillaume de Machaut, Canon of Reims. Most of the music of these composers seems to have been intended for combined vocal-instrumental performance, although this is seldom expressly indicated in the manuscripts. Medieval composers probably had no rigid expectations about performance media. Until the 17th century, and even through the 19th in the case of domestic performance, the choice of instruments was likely to be dependent as much on available performers as on anything else. Many sources do, however, indicate that medieval musicians tended to separate instruments into two groups, loud and soft, and to prefer contrasting sonorities within those groups for maximum differentiation of the individual parts. Outdoor ceremonial music would be performed with loud instruments, and room music, with soft ones. Paintings and manuscript illuminations of the period show that much secular performance included a wide variety of bells, drums, and other percussion instruments and instruments with drones, bagpipes, fiddles, double recorders, hurdy-gurdies. The parts for these instruments are never found in the musical sources and must be reconstructed for modern performance. The notation of medieval music often is misleading for the modern performer. Accidentals were often omitted as being understood. Further, it seems likely that variation, embellishment, and improvisation were very important elements of medieval performance. It is known that sections of some 15th century two-part vocal music were enhanced by an extempore third part, in a technique called faux bourdon. The notation of the 15th century bass dance consisted of only a single line of unmeasured long notes, evidently used by the performing group of three instrumentalists for improvisation, much as a modern jazz combos chart. Much of medieval secular music is a mystery. Most people were illiterate, therefore most music was not written down but passed on and learned by ear, and so, of course, we've lost it. The music that was written down was most often church music, as it was largely clergy who could write. This ecclesiastical music is important in itself, but its predominance in surviving manuscripts gives a partial view of music making. Medieval music is not immediately accessible for a modern musician. There were different systems of musical notation, none of which indicated precise rhythm until the 12th century. Square notation is now the best-known system developed in this period, and once you know square notation, some of the music is easy to read. At times, though, it wasn't written very accurately, or was written with a poor pen and so had vague or indecipherable note values, which is adequate if you know what it's supposed to sound like, which they did, but we don't. It is extremely rare for us to have any idea what the intended instrument was to accompany a voice or to play for dances, so we have to make our own choices from the scant available information and our sense of what sounds right. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more videos.